On behalf of the Horizons Project, Beyond Conflict and Urban Rural Action, we're really excited to have you here. My name is Tabitha Pilgrim Thompson. I'm the Director for Partnerships and Outreach at the Horizons Project, which is an organization that's committed to building relationships across communities, working to build just, diverse, and peaceful democracy here in the US. And we're excited to be a part of the Listen First Coalition and participate in our very first National Week of Conversation to talk about a topic that's really important to us, which you got a sense for in the poll, and that is how we as a people can strengthen and revitalize our democracy and protect it from authoritarian threats. And so the first step to that is really understanding how you all in the room see the US and where it falls on that kind of spectrum. So before I hand it over to my colleagues, just a quick setting for the event. The first part will actually feature a conversation between my colleague, Dr. Maria J. Stephan, the co-lead and chief organizer at Horizons, and Michelle Barsa, who is a key partner and the director of the Democracy and Social Identity Program at Beyond Conflict. I won't go too far in their bios. My colleague Nalanka will put them in the chat, and we shared them in the event overview. But together, these women represent decades of experience as organizers, facilitators, with backgrounds in the social justice, democracy, and peace building space. So we're really excited to hear from both of them.
I just really wanted to first say how pleased we are at the Horizons Project to be partnering with Beyond Conflict and with Urban Rural Action on today's National Week of Conversation event focused on revitalizing democracy and countering authoritarianism in the US. And it's really been a fun and great partnership working on this together. So I think, like everyone in this Zoom room, I'm deeply concerned about the state of US democracy. I'm concerned about the widening gap between haves and have-nots. I'm concerned about the corrupting influence of money in politics, about the toxic levels of polarization, about the weakening of democratic norms, and the rise of political and extremist violence. And I think your poll reflections earlier kind of, sit well with where I am, and also where a number of recent studies about the state of democracy place the US. You all may have heard of the organizations Freedom House and the Varieties of Democracy, International IDEA, which for the first time have downgraded democracy in the US and have indicated that the US is now a backsliding democracy. So obviously not fully autocratic or authoritarian, but backsliding. So I'm deeply concerned about that. By way of very brief background, I come from Vermont, where our politics are wonderfully weird, but also where communities place a very high premium on self-organizing and self-help. And I'm also a political scientist by training, which hopefully won't elicit any virtual tomatoes being thrown at me. But I've spent the past 2 decades researching and writing about the dynamics of authoritarian regimes that have spanned the political spectrum from the far left to the far right. But perhaps equally important or more important for this conversation is that during this time, I've also focused extensively on how citizen campaigns and movements for rights, freedoms, and democracy in the US and around the world, including places like Nicaragua, Russia, Turkey, Sudan, Ukraine, how the strategies and tactics that these movements have used to counter authoritarianism and to prevent backsliding democracy. And I know that we can learn from these struggles. I know that our struggles are very interconnected. So in fact, when a mentor of mine, Mark Palmer, who was the US ambassador to Hungary during the 1989 revolution there, Mark Palmer also wrote Ronald Reagan's Tear Down That Wall speech. And he was also someone who was active in the civil rights movement, marched during that movement. He inspired me to join the State Department almost a decade ago. And, as part of that work, I was deployed to places, to conflict zones, Afghanistan, Syria, where I kind of had a front row seat to the worst forms of tyranny and authoritarianism. So I saw how it tore societies apart, undermined social cohesion, prevented human flourishing. And I know that, the democratic backsliding and authoritarianism in the US is not like these other places. We have our own unique situation, our own unique context. But at the same time, I'm, following the patterns of authoritarian resurgence in the US and around the world, and am deeply concerned about what is happening in the US. But also, by virtue of having worked with and studied pro-democracy movements, I know that we can do something about it. We're not helpless. And so, the strongest bulwark against authoritarianism in this country and around the world is an organized and confident citizenry that is capable of coming together across difference and undertaking collective action to challenge authoritarianism and to build a democracy that works for all of us. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from, why it's something that's urgent for me, and also what gives me great hope in this moment. So, okay, we're talking about authoritarianism, democracy. Let's start by framing these terms and what we're actually talking about. So, Michelle, there are lots of different definitions for these terms. What do we mean in this context, in this Zoom meeting, when we say democracy and authoritarianism?
Thanks, Maria. So before I dive into the definitions of democracy and authoritarianism that we're going to be using to ground today's discussion, let me offer the caveat that in the interest of prioritizing space for inclusive dialogue, we're not going to get into the specific definitions for the various types of democracies and authoritarian regimes. So my apologies in advance to anyone in the Zoom room with a political science degree. You may hear us conflate some things like authoritarianism and populism, and for that we beg in advance for your forgiveness. But for today, we'll be relying on the definition of democracy that's articulated in a report called Our Common Purpose, which was compiled by a national and bipartisan commission on the practice of democratic citizenship. We'll think of democracy as the forms of rights-based representative government in which elected government leadership is constrained by constitutionalism, the rule of law, the separation of powers, the free expression of the people, and the legal protection and moral affirmation of the rights of individuals. And importantly, systems in which groups and parties that are not part of electoral majorities cannot be easily disenfranchised or suffer loss of rights by those elected to power. So the main themes here are accountability, rule of law, personal freedoms, and protections for minority rights. We'll be thinking here about democracy as a massive voluntary exercise, a huge group project where we all agree to abide by a set of rules that secure individual freedoms equally across groups while preventing the abuse of power. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, stands in fundamental contrast to democracy. It's a principle here of blind submission to authority as opposed to reverence for individual freedoms of thought and action. We'll be thinking about it or referring to it here as any political system that consolidates power in the hands of a leader or a small elite, small group of leaders that is not constitutionally responsible to the body of the people. A system that employs direct and or indirect tactics to fight democracy in a way that minimizes checks and balances, limits political pluralism, suppresses or discredits those who oppose the government, and leverages expansive executive authority to consolidate power. So the main themes here are power concentrated in the hands of the few who are not accountable to the many, resulting in limits on political legitimacy, rights protections, and popular mobilization. Okay, so we're going to keep it short and sweet. Maria, why don't you maybe take us through a couple of the warning signs or ways to spot rising authoritarianism or democratic decline? Sure,
thanks, Michelle. And just adding to the last part about kind of authoritarianism, is it a single individual, is it a group of individuals? I think the first important point to drive home is that authoritarianism is not a single individual or group of individuals. It is actually a system that is made up of pillars of support, organizations and institutions that provide the human and material support that authoritarian regimes need or authoritarian systems need to maintain power. So just conceptualize authoritarianism as a system vice individual or a small group of individuals. So folks may have heard of the great book by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt called How Democracies Die. And I take a lot of inspiration from that book and definitely commend it, or an article version of that book, to you all. So the authors describe the processes that lead to democratic erosion and the consolidation of authoritarianism in different countries around the world. And their main argument is that since the end of the Cold War, most democratic breakdowns, so think places like Hungary, Venezuela, India, Turkey, has happened gradually with a whimper as opposed to a bang, as they write. This democratic erosion is caused not by violent coups necessarily, but by democratically elected leaders who subvert the processes and institutions that brought them into power in order to maintain and abuse their grip on power. So many of these efforts are in fact legal. They're approved by courts and legislatures, which makes countering it quite difficult. So citing another political scientist, Juan Lintz, they describe four main indicators of authoritarian behavior. The first is the rejection of the democratic rules of the game, whether that's by, imposing restrictions on the right to vote, or imposing unnecessary restrictions on the right to vote, whether it involves undermining the independence of election officials, announcing that you may or may not, adhere to the results of an election. These are all common practices used by authoritarians around the world. Secondly, something is authoritarian if it's denying the legitimacy of opponents. So referring to an opponent as traitors or enemies of the people, and refusing to accept them as legitimate competitors. So third, and a key attribute of authoritarianism is the toleration and encouragement of violence. So the harassment or threatening of opponents, siding with paramilitary groups, or at least refusing to condemn the use of political violence to advance political goals. And then finally, a key attribute of authoritarianism is indicating a willingness to curtail civil liberties of opponents. And that could involve cracking down on free speech, on free assembly, on the right to peaceful protest. So all of these are kind of common tactics that have been used in different kind of autocratic or semi-autocratic backsliding democracies around the world. And a really important point from Levitsky and Ziblatt is that democratic systems ultimately are held together by unwritten rules and norms. And when those norms are eroded, it's very difficult for a constitution or for institutions to provide a check on abuses of power. So Michelle, you've been looking at the brain and the behavioral science behind this. So what insights can you offer on the psychological underpinnings of democracy and authoritarianism?
Yeah. Well, I want to focus today on the science, or better said, the politics of fear, particularly how the manipulation of fear relates to the brand of authoritarian populism that we see on the rise, not just in the US, but globally. And so we'll start with this basic concept of fear. The human brain itself is not partisan. It pursues the singular, apolitical aim of trying to keep you alive. And to do that, it scans for threat and danger in its environment. It codifies memories of fear, and it guides behaviors that it thinks will keep you safe from harm. It does not necessarily search for truth in that process. As another way to keep you safe, your mind seeks belonging in groups and collectives, driving your desire to join groups of others who are like you, which academics call in-groups, to help defend against potential threats from groups to which you do not belong, which academics call outgroups. Because your personal identity is tied to your group's identity, keeping your core group safe is equated with keeping you safe. So in this process, our brains don't necessarily distinguish between material threats to our physical safety and threats to our identities. Identity threats here can relate to whether our groups are seen as moral or good. They can relate to potential losses of power and influence, or whether our groups are allowed to freely express their culture, abide by their preferred values, etc. We have this natural impulse to defend the status and power of our group. And it's important to remember that it's our perceptions of this threat that are more likely to activate fear than any actual or objectively assessed measure of threat. So what happens when we perceive threats to our identity? Well, the answer is a range of things that are far more complex than this graphic I made for today's discussion. So maybe I should have begged forgiveness from the social psychologists in the room too, but here's the gist of it. The salience of the various identities that we hold, because we all sit with many identities, the salience of each of those identities is affected by context and threat. So I'm Arab American, for example. When I go to visit my family in Egypt, my Arab identity becomes much more salient to me in that context. But similarly, if I'm in the US and I hear someone saying hateful things about Arabs, or in other words, I perceive a threat, my Arab identity becomes more central to me in a very similar way. Threat also impacts the salience of information. When we feel threatened, we're more likely to see threat in the information we consume, even if it's not objectively there. And I'll keep making this point. Threat literally affects the processing of information, meaning that you could read the same article in conditions of safety and under conditions of threat, and depending on the context and a variety of factors, could take away entirely different conclusions. Also, when a group perceives itself to be under threat, there's a greater tendency to assume the outgroup, this threatening group, dislikes or dehumanizes you. And in the US, for example, Democrats and Republicans consistently overestimate this, assuming that members of the other party dehumanize them more than 2 times than they actually do. And so what happens as a result of that? Of course, you don't want to engage in dialogue or deliberation with someone you think dehumanizes you. What would be the point? But if that perception is based on your estimation and not the reality, imagine the possibilities if we could meaningfully correct those misperceptions. When intergroup conflict occurs, and here's some of the brain science, oxytocin levels increase. So you've heard of oxytocin, right? The love hormone. Don't tell any neuroscientists that I just called it that, but the surge of oxytocin in these contexts increases affiliation with in-group members, with our own group members. It's like we're all compelled to link arms and hunker down. We feel increased love and empathy towards our own group, and an increased desire to seek revenge against any group that might be attacking our group. What follows is this decreased willingness to challenge the norms and beliefs of your own group. So group's norms or the social rules of a group are what keeps the group safe, secure, and consistent, especially in times of uncertainty. And we're programmed to abide by these norms to support the survival of the group. It's also in these moments, as we become more inwardly focused with our own group, less willing to challenge the norms and beliefs of the group, that we're more inclined to look for leaders who will defend our group against any external threat. And this can rise above attachments that we may have to abstract democratic principles or codified democratic laws. I was at another Horizons Project event, actually, where a Serbian activist named Ivan Marovic said that it's in this stage that truth dies because it doesn't matter. And he's right, because in this state of threat, it's about survival, not reason. But forget all this. If you only remember one thing, it should be that threat and the fear that it elicits are fundamental psychological processes that govern how we think and behave. That part is fundamentally human. The manipulation of fear to achieve and consolidate power, that part is political. So what does this look like in the US right now? Well, our country is changing rapidly and in many different ways. There are demographic changes that predict a white minority in about 2 or 3 decades. There's the successful mass mobilization of social justice movements that is inviting a national reckoning on race, forcing us to confront a painful past and present. There are unprecedented levels of inequality, and now, of course, a pandemic that both highlights our interdependence and provides fodder for our divisions. These factors contribute to a documented rise in the extent to which majority populations, which happen to be white and Christian in this country, feel threatened or perceive threats to their identity. And it's a particular type of social identity threat relating to a fear over losing structural power, as well as losing a particular way of life and social prestige, a feeling of being left behind, you could say. This perception of threat is readily exploited and manufactured by politicians and media. So you can think, for example, about replacement theory in the news and this narrative that white people are being steadily replaced by immigrants and people of color. You can see things like in a recent study, there are 42% of white respondents perceived that other groups wanted to restrict white Americans' ability to express themselves and their culture. And still there are other studies that show that individuals who believe that minority group members have too much power are more likely to want to take the law into their own hands, to view political violence as legitimate, and to mistrust election results. So what does this mean, I guess, for where we are as a country? We went through a more technical definition of democracy, but I think the most common association with the term is this of the people, by the people, for the people idea, which begs the question, where are the people? Who is showing up? Who is not showing up, and why? And this interest in participating in the democratic project is important and has psychological underpinnings. It's driven predominantly by two things, by social trust and trust in public institutions. And Maria's going to get a little bit more into this and what that means in terms of adherence to democratic norms, our willingness to uphold those democratic norms or violate them. But the last point I'll make is that there is a difference between whether a person or group highly values democratic norms, thinks that they're important, and whether or not they are willing to violate those norms. The two things are tied to different psychological processes. How much we value democratic norms and embrace political tolerance relates to how much we as individuals and groups internalize abstract democratic principles and fuse those principles with our sense of identity. Conversely, whether we're willing to violate those norms when it comes to certain groups, that is determined by threat. Maria, now that we've covered the basics of human psychology in relation to identity threat, can you talk us through some of the tactics that authoritarians use to exploit these psychological dynamics? And I guess importantly, what we as citizens can do to address, mitigate, or even reverse some of these alarming trends?
Sure. So, so the authoritarian playbook basically has been translated into lots of different languages and has been adapted to local contexts. And I think it's important to recognize the patterns of behavior so that we then can have a sense of how to respond. So I've tried to summarize some key elements of this playbook from different anthropologists, historians, political scientists. So normally a slide like this would be about an hour-and-a-half long presentation, but I'm going to run through pretty quickly so that we can especially get to what we can do about this. So, first and foremost, divide and rule is at the heart of authoritarian control. The idea, perpetuating the idea that democracy is a fixed pie, and when they gain, you lose, and only me or the party can protect you and your interests. Authoritarians regularly use legal or pseudo-legal practices to gut institutions and weaken oppositions. They pass laws that restrict the franchise. They co-opt, take over media outlets. They criminalize protests, which is a very common occurrence around the world. Thirdly, and this idea of truth is so difficult because of what Michelle just recounted about how we, embrace or don't truth and whether it matters. But authoritarians regularly undermine the public's belief in truth by flooding the system with misinformation, disinformation. And of course, people don't necessarily need to believe the lies. They just need to question that any kind of truth actually exists. Authoritarians regularly demonize opponents, especially elites and activists and unfriendly media. They call them traitors, elitist scum. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, has heard some variation of this. Fifth, they blame minorities and immigrants for problems, notably in many countries for problems associated with crime and unemployment. Authoritarians will very craftily pay off supporters including by backing their electoral campaigns, and punish defectors by either ostracizing them or PNGing them. Very common occurrence. Authoritarians will counter-mobilize authoritarian supporters. The visual that comes to mind, the stadium rallies that Putin hosted in Russia around Ukraine. This is a regular occurrence to kind of counter-mobilize your supporters, pay them to come in some cases. And then finally, and I think the most insidious aspect of the authoritarian playbook is making ordinary people feel like they are powerless, that they actually can't do anything to change their circumstances. Things are beyond their control. And when things are beyond the control of ordinary people, the implication is that the authoritarian has to control and manage everything. So, and this is where, I just personally take a lot of hope and inspiration from the research on pro-democracy movements around the world. We know that people are capable of achieving change, including in very difficult environments and in very repressive environments. The history of social progress in the United States proves it. So what we know, the bottom line finding from the research on pro-democracy movements is that the most powerful antidote to authoritarianism is broad-based coalitions and movements that bring people together across difference and draw on their skills and creativity to take power away from authoritarian systems and to build up a more powerful alternative. So we know that large, diverse movements that draw on participants from many different parts of society, so young, old, rich, poor, men, women, professionals, workers from different races, religions, ethnic backgrounds. Diversity is key for representation, for legitimacy, and for leverage. So we also know that movements are more successful when they're able to manage constructive tensions, center relationships, and prioritize larger collective goals. Movements succeed when they focus on not just what they're against, authoritarianism, they focus on what they're for, a society that works for everyone, where everyone belongs. So being able to listen to your fellow citizens actively, hear what they deeply care about, what their aspirations are, and come up with a unifying proposition for why people should participate in this movement for democracy, grounded in a shared vision of tomorrow based on an understanding of our past and where we're going. So then we know from the research that what is really key in effective pro-democracy movements is being able to shift the loyalties of individuals and recruit individuals from key pillars of support. This idea of pillars of support. So businesses, media institutions, bureaucracies, educational institutions, labor unions, professional groups, student groups. So being able to recognize that there are no monolithic pillars. All of these pillars of support are heterogeneous. They contain people who have very different loyalties, interests, passions, and the like. So being able to call them into a movement is really important. And then expanding the repertoire of nonviolent tactics. There is more to movements than protests and demonstrations and anger. And there's a lot of different things people can do, ranging from vigils to wearing of symbolic symbols, to boycotts, to strikes, to walkouts, to sit-ins. So expanding the imagination is so important, because the more tactics you employ, the more people you can bring into the movement and the more leverage that a movement has to affect change. And then training, people, you can't magically run a business or an organization. Similarly, you need training to be able to organize people, to build broad-based coalitions, to minimize violence and radical flanks, to be able to enhance nonviolent discipline. These are all skills-based activities, which again is what makes me so hopeful and about our prospects here in the US. And then finally, in addition to nonviolent discipline, being able to develop methods for de-escalating violence. And there's a whole slew of them, and I know that so many people on this call are experts in violence interruption, unarmed civilian protection, and various tools of de-escalation. So those are a few of the kind of what we can do and what we know about what has been effective in other movements. And I think now to get at how we can achieve mass participation and build a broad-based coalition, I'm going to turn it over to Kira from Urban Rural Action, who will take us into the next section.